Gillette said you were having a little trouble with your approach, Faris hinted delicately. Yeah, I did that once. I see that. You did good today. Thank you. Merry Christmas. That night, after delivering Christmas dinner to the scout groups, we started our turkey portions. Then we sang a couple of cheerful songs and ate some of the goodies our wives and families had sent us, and I, needless to say, shed a tear before I went to bed. What the hell is this? Gary Resler said indignantly, crouching beside his bunk. A barrage of fire rumbled outside. Why? I shook my head perplexedly in the dark. Madness. A machine gun crackled right outside the tent. I shoved my ass even deeper under the bunk, between the struts, closed my eyes, trying to imagine that the chaos outside was just a dream. The crackle of the machine gun was lost in the rumble of hundreds of other guns going off. I was hiding from this madness. A shadow slid down the aisle of the tent, tripping over a loose board under my head. Pistol shots rang out in the tent. Then the shadow disappeared. The fire continued. We sat inside with Gary and Riker. The rest of us were outside in the trench. Perhaps it was safer there. Our bunks couldn't stop the bullets, but I felt safer lying on the floor in the dark. Shall we get out of here? Gary suggested from his corner. We tried, remember. A jerky cracking sounded just beyond the tarpaulin wall. They won't stop, I shouted. The roaring madness resembled a storm. I'll never forget New Year's Eve 1965, I thought. When there was a lull, Gary said. I think it's settled down. I'll go out. You'll be back anyway. He didn't hear me. The boards creaked as he got up and left. He came back 5 minutes later. I felt someone stomping down our aisle again. Mason, Resler. You guys here? Captain Faris. Yeah, I said from the floor. Well, get out there and stop them. Stop them. We tried. You try again. Let's go, he hustled out of the tent. Oh, what a load of crap. I heard my own voice. All right, let's go, Gary said. Under the tracer-strewn sky, a fifth-grade specialist stood with an M60 machine gun at his hip, firing away. A haze hung around him, but it couldn't hide the demonic expression on his face. Enough, I yelled. Put the machine gun away. The fifth-class specialist shook his head and smiled wickedly. He watched his tracers soar into the sky toward Hong Kong Hill. God, there are people on that hill, a bunch of people, I thought. It had all started with people shooting into the sky on New Year's Eve. Now it was completely out of control, and the bullets were flying toward the radio relay unit at the top of the hill. At one point, return tracers flew from above. The liaison men were firing back at the division. The colonel scrambled over his legs like a spider, maneuvering between piles of sandbags, trenches and tent, bumping into his distraught soldiers. 50 feet away, he stopped and roared at the soldier holding the machine gun. Stop. I order you to stop. The soldier stopped firing with an annoyed look. The battalion commander was beginning to annoy him. He smiled menacingly and turned his hip-mounted M60 toward the colonel, pointing it at his chest. The colonel jerked to the side and looked at Gary and me. Do something, he shouted, his eyes bulging. What we shrugged. He bent down and hurried back to his tent. Finally, there was silence. At 1:30 in the morning or so, the battle at Hong Kong Hill had ceased. The airplanes that had been circling nearby since the firefight began were able to land. The firing ceased, and the soldiers laid down their weapons. The new year continued, but in complete silence. Several people have been killed at the maintenance base, Connors reported. We sat silently in our bunks in the light as if nothing had happened. How many? Someone asked. 7, I think. There's more wounded, he said quietly, staring at the floor. Hot party, huh? Soon after Resler and I talked about escaping on the Huey, one foggy morning a helicopter from Snake Company, flight number 808, flew to Lima with rations and supplies on board and disappeared forever. The pilots made contact once before the pass and reported that they were going to fly ahead despite virtually zero visibility. By 9000 I was flying with the search party. They could not be located before sunset, no sign of them. Do you think they did it? Resler asked. Nope. Stupid idea. The next day, half a dozen helicopters from the battalion scoured the entire jungle for several miles around the pass, looking for the missing men. No luck. The 1st Squad, a helicopter division, in fact had lost the Huey in its own territory. The situation did not go well. Meanwhile, the supply sergeants kept their fingers crossed that they would have a rare opportunity to balance the asset logs and resolve all the issues at once. An explanation is required here. In the Army, the right amount of military equipment was distributed to the company supply offices. Once or twice a year, the inspectors general, envoys from the high command, came to inspect the equipment, which had to be either in the supply depot show or in the logbook. If shortages were found, endless paperwork began. Commanders and supply officers were called on the carpet. Searches were conducted. That's how the official Army system worked. The unofficial Army supply system worked in a roundabout way. Supply officers bought and sold surplus to cover their asses, and the inspectors never suspected a thing. Unless, of course, they themselves had served as supply officers in the past. In the unofficial system, the property logs were put in nice shape and maintained by supply officers, but we still didn't have jungle boots or chest armor. Some things we had to get ourselves. I was able to barter a pair of jungle boots from a grumpy supply man for a bottle of whiskey. You couldn't get body armor. There were only a few in the whole battalion. All the supply men dreamed of padding their logbooks once and for all without all this haggling and bartering. Flight 808 looked like the perfect solution. After 2 days of searching, some kind of Huey was found. It was the wreckage of a courier helicopter that had disappeared en route to Pleiku a year ago. The search was called off. Helicopter 808 was reported missing. The helicopter's move to missing status set the gears of clerical mechanism in motion throughout the battalion. Supply officers were happy when asked if there was anything aboard the missing helicopter. Okay, since you brought it up, I did indeed have 6 sapper blades on board, plus some cloth tape, 7 tapes to be exact, 3 thermoses, 4 first aid packs, 24 flashlights, and so on. When all the reports were turned in, Captain Gillette told me that the helicopter was to carry 5 tons of assorted Army equipment, about 5 times our normal load. Not a helicopter, but a beast, eh, boys? Gillette was having fun. Maybe that's why it crashed, Gary said. Light overload. 8,000 pounds, so to speak. Yeah, there won't be a second one. The fighting in Happy Valley had died down again. High Command considered it a sign of victory. Why? Because we'd taken heavy casualties and gained complete control of the airspace. Wendell thought that the Communists decided to withdraw from the battle for a while. They often did this trick with the French. Instead of taking up arms, the Charlies went to the rice paddies and started working. We didn't believe him. We thought that the hordes of bloodthirsty enemies had had their fill and had retreated into the jungle, licking their wounds. But Wendell claimed they were lost among the peasants, because they were peasants themselves. Just before Christmas, a group of Montagnard mercenaries had rioted and killed more than 20 Republic of Vietnam Army officers at Mang Yang Pass. The cavalry then posted guards at the pass and near the bridges on Route 19, which led to Pleiku. American reconnaissance teams set up their base near the highway. We delivered food, clothing, mail, and ammunition there every day. 4 or 5 of our company's helicopters were assigned to supply flights. Resler and I flew one of these machines, logging 6 to 8 hours of flying time each day. We could not get used to the truce period. Death, constant danger, and the frantic rhythm of the past few weeks had cultivated in us a combat mindset and a readiness for long battles. Supplying a few scouting parties on a guarded road was such a trivial endeavor that we began to amuse ourselves in every way possible. Resler and I were doing low-altitude turns over the road, trying to keep the car as level in the air as possible. One time we swooped down on a convoy. The military police in the convoy thought we were crazy and reported us to our battalion. Faris was already waiting on our doorstep when we returned to camp that night. He said we had scared the military to death. If I ever hear about your cowboy antics again, He paused and thought for a moment. What could he do to us? Put us in a corner? Send us home? What would he do to us? Tomorrow's your day off. You two just volunteered to build an officer's home. That's clever. The rumours were true. The 229th Battalion was being moved to Bong Sun Valley. Every scout helicopter that flew into this coastal valley 50 miles north of Quin Sun came under fire from the ground. The Viet Cong considered this territory theirs. The Cavalry, Marines, Navy and Army of the Republic of Vietnam were planning a massive joint operation. The Navy was to bombard the landing zones with heavy artillery. The Marines were to land on the beach north of the valley. The Cavalry was to rush into the thick of it and seize territory. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was to hang around somewhere nearby. One of the scout pilots, a warrant officer from a neighbouring platoon, went into the company headquarters tent and turned in his wings a silver pilot's badge he had earned before World War II. He placed it on the table and said, "That's enough." "My God, what's going to happen to him now?" Ressler asked. "I don't know." "Can't you just say no?" I asked Connors. I wish I knew, Connors replied. Maybe they'd shoot him or cut his balls off, maybe even make him build an officer's house. The refusenik was quickly taken away. A few weeks later we learned that he had been transferred inland to work at a recreation and recuperation centre. It never once occurred to us that we could have just said no. Technically, we were all volunteers, and if someone got really sick of it, they had the right to refuse to fly. But to decide to do something like that, to just give up, no doubt it was a smart move, but it was too stupid. How do you live with that? A couple days later, we had a couple of farewell landings in the good old Ya Drang Valley, after which the Army of the Republic of Vietnam reported that the North Vietnamese Army was gathering forces near the Cambodian border. About 24 crews from our battalion, including Nate and me, flew reconnaissance missions. Sherman rarely flew as a squad leader, but the aging captain, now in his 40s, needed hours of combat flying to make it to major. Our brave commander of the combat sortie into the ominous valley was nervous and cocky at the briefing. The plan was for us to get to the Plai Diering Special Forces camp near the Cambodian border and then split into groups of 4 vehicles to land grunts at strategic points. Nate flew the route to the camp while I had fun with the maps. Navigation wasn't required during formation flying, but I always wondered what kind of arse I'd gotten myself into this time. We flew over Turkey Farm at 2,000 feet, heading southwest. Half an hour later, I spotted the proposed camp on our left 5 miles away, but Sherman kept leading the formation straight ahead. Approaching the frontier, I reported. "How far?" Nate asked. "Actually, I think we're right over it." "Really?" Yellow 1, Yellow 2. Yellow 1 was Sherman. Yellow 2, Morris and Decker. Copy that, Yellow 2. Let's move forward. Yellow 1, I think we'd better turn around. Hurry up, Morris hissed. There was silence. I pictured Sherman folding and unfolding and crumpling the maps, trying to figure out what part of the damn jungle he was over. Yellow 2, we're on course. Negative, Yellow 1. We've overflew our target. That's how Morris tried to explain that we were already heading over Cambodia. Another pause. Negative, Yellow 2. I'm holding course. Morris's confusion was transmitted through the microphone. Roger that. Poor Sherman had screwed up and still didn't realize it. His first real combat mission as commander. Goodbye, Major's stripes. After flying 5 miles deep into the jungle marked Cambodia on the map, Sherman's helicopter jerked. He took a left, then a right, and only then turned. He didn't even command, just turned around. Yeah, only a total asshole would get lost in this fucking jungle, Nate said. The communications channel was silent until our expeditionary formation returned to the right place. From that day on, poor Sherman was entrusted only with such exciting and prestigious tasks as commanding the excavation of a company well. As we crossed the border, the communications channel came alive. Sherman called Connors and informed him that our unit was to remain on the ground as a reserve force after we landed. He then ordered all of us to pull into a column. The helicopters were lined up in a single row for landing at Play Deering. As the first vehicles began to level off over the ground, they were completely engulfed by puffs of red dust. Special forces raked the landing strip with bulldozers, and the drought turned the embankment to dust. "Don't hover. Get on the ground right away," Sherman commanded. We couldn't even see the helicopters that had landed in the red clouds. I followed Connors. When he got to within 50 feet of the ground, the dust from the car ahead of him obscured his view. He commanded a second circle. He went up again and took a right. I followed him. The third and fourth helicopters of our squad moved forward and landed. After making a circle, Connors and I found ourselves in the very tail. As we leveled off for the second attempt, I moved farther away from Connors to avoid getting hit by the puffs of dust. 10 feet off the ground, Connors evaporated. It was my turn, the last chopper in the convoy. Roots and bare bushes stuck out in abundance at the far end of the runway. As I leveled off, the jet from the carrier propeller stirred up the dust and everything around me disappeared. I felt the impact. It sounded like we'd hit a stump, which happened often enough during landings, so I decided to move a few feet forward. Which way forward? Which way up? There were only seconds left to make a decision. The compass indicated we were turning right. I pushed in the left pedal to stop the rotation. It didn't work. The tail rotor had failed. In such cases, it was necessary to quickly cut power to stop the mechanical rotation of the tail rotor and go into hovering autorotation. We had practiced this action in flight school hundreds of times. I tried to pull the engine control lever to stop the rotation, but it was locked. Nate, who was flying as crew chief, had locked the lever for the duration of the flight. It was impossible for me to reach it from my seat. There was no time to discuss the problem with Nate either. The helicopter was spinning on its axis and risked a major accident, so I decided to land the car without waiting for it to spin too fast. The car hit the ground and jumped on its skids, tilted to the left side, hovered menacingly in the air, and slammed back down. We popped out long before the dust had completely settled. It didn't seem so bad. The machine was crooked on its skids, the tail gearbox was dangling from a bundle of cables, the tail rotor itself was bent and warped. Connors approached with genuine concern. What happened? Apparently, I hit something with the tail rotor. Nate, Connors, Banjo, and I, along with a grief-stricken Reacher, began wandering around the car, looking for a stump, a root, or any suitable cause of such damage, but to no avail. Finally, Nate squatted down and beckoned to us. "A root?" I exclaimed. "Looks like it," Nate said. "Look, you cut right here." He pointed to a fresh notch on a shriveled root sticking out of the ground. It was about 2 feet off the ground. "Fuck," I said. "Don't worry, Mason." "No one would have seen it in all that dust," Nate reassured me. I didn't see him. "Yeah, but you weren't driving." There was no way around it. I cursed my bad luck, but Nate and Connors kept assuring me it wasn't my fault. Reacher walked over and said, "It's all right, Mr. Mason. She'll be fixed in no time." I was relieved. Reacher knew his business. It was his car, the most powerful in the company, the one Liz had used to haul that heavy load. If Reacher thought it wasn't that bad, it wasn't that bad. Nate and I headed to the Special Forces headquarters barracks to pass the time until the flight back. Reacher decided to stay with the Huey and wait for the Chinook, which was to take the helicopter by cable back to camp for repairs. "Would you guys like a beer?" one of the counselors asked. He was wearing a camouflage Vietnam Ranger uniform covered in red dust. The red dust was embedded in the skin of everyone in the camp. "Sure," Nate replied. We were done flying for the day anyway, so we might as well have a drink. We sat on a bunk under a tarp and sipped our beers while the other crews launched the grunts, started up, and flew away. Half an hour later, the dust settled again. "How do you like it anyway?" the counselor asked. "Beer? No, a place." Plädiering. The asshole of the world. Dusty. Yeah, we breed it on purpose, but it doesn't smell like shit. A lone Huey courier landed at the campground. Nate and I asked to hitch a ride to Pleiku. Upon request, the pilot contacted the battalion that was en route and reported our location. Sherman replied that he would send someone to pick us up near the end of the day. Camp Holloway in Pleiku was familiar territory. We immediately went to the officer's house, drank more beer, and threw change into the slot machines. I was still worried about the helicopter breakdown. I wasn't at all interested in having fun. While the rest of the crew was flying under bullets, I was acting like a classic counselor, drinking beer, playing slot machines, and generally bullshitting. All because of my incompetence, no one but me had hit the route. So I drank more beer than I should have. So did Nate. He suggested we head into town, since we were stuck here until tonight. I agreed. We decided it would be best to walk to town, so we set off. When we got about a mile in, the sunlight started to fade. Look, Nate, I'm having trouble seeing. It's like a haze. I stopped. Me too. The sky had turned a pale orange, even though the sun was still high. Man, every time I get drunk too early, shit happens. But this is too much, Nate said. As we tried to blink away the darkening world, we saw the battalion coming toward Camp Holloway. The sun flared brighter. Aha, I exclaimed. It's not a drink, it's a solar eclipse. That's right, Nate grinned. We weren't in danger of blacking out and falling into the unknown. The sun shone brightly, and the formation clapped, whistled, and rumbled through the air, coming in for a landing. We rushed back to Holloway to join our comrades. The damage was originally estimated at $10,000, but then the figure soared to $100,000. The Board of Inquiry decided that extreme dusty conditions were the cause. I was blown away. Usually their verdict was pilot error. Even if the blades flew off in flight, the pilot was posthumously accused of violating pre-flight inspection rules. I once saw Huey's blades penetrate the cockpit and decapitate 2 pilots while the car was on the ground. The pilots were found guilty of ignoring flight logbook entries. Earlier, the helicopter's flight mechanic had put a red cross in it while dealing with a track control linkage. Pilot error. If the Huey planted itself on a sharp stump during the landing, it was pilot error. If the car rolled down a mountain after an unsuccessful landing on an elevated area under fire, it was pilot error. As a rule, there were no other verdicts, so it was very generous of the board to admit that the accident was the result of extreme conditions, but I still believed that it was pilot error.we managed to completely take over Happy Valley, but we still had to go back and dot all the I's and T's. Someone forgot to inform the Charlies that they lost, so they kept sitting in the jungle and shooting down helicopters, stupid cretins. The news of our victory over the North Vietnamese army in the Ya Drang Valley was so beautifully presented by the press that the cavalry took on a new mythical quality that was usually bestowed on the Marines. We had become pros. That the press was not slumbering became clear when we were sent to support a unit that had just arrived from Hawaii. When we landed to pick up the soldiers, they rushed toward us like children when they saw the famous Airmobile Brigade. We were the celebrities, the front line of the units that would drive the communists back north, flatten them out. In 2 days we managed to make 12 landings in areas that we had captured many times before. What was most frustrating was that the Viet Cong fought even more fiercely. One of the zones was located near a sparse jungle at the foot of the hills. I was the 3rd helicopter in the left wing of the formation. Our squad was the 2nd to land. The attack helicopters were chattering nearby, and the onboard machine gunners were shooting up the bushes. The smoke from the gunnery training billowed in the sky, and as we got within 500 feet of the ground, red tracers flashed between us. By then I'd learned to get comfortable with the controls of the helicopter and suppress my fear. I even got brave. We're in Happy Valley. I'd been here many times, and it was nothing like the Ya Drang Valley. Besides, I was a pro. The closer we got, the stronger the fire from the invisible Charlies became. We continued to enter the area. At the very end of the approach, about 100 feet above the ground, I saw a smooth stream of tracers coming from the left side. Who are they aiming at? Who is coming after me? Then the stream began to move toward my helicopter. We have been targeted. We're in the crosshairs. Damn it, we're in the crosshairs. I couldn't leave my position in the formation or dodge. I was right behind the second car with the fourth chopper breathing down my neck. All right, let's keep going. I felt Gary grab the controls. The tracers were very close, millimeters away from the cockpit. I clenched up, like I was hoping to deflect the bullets. My hands were numb, my chin was stiff, my fingers were numb. No, the bullets can't get me. All I could see was my wristwatch. Why the watch? I didn't even look at it. It was a gold square Hamilton's I'd gotten from my grandfather. There was a separate dial for the second hand, right above the number 6. The hand stood still. At that moment I could safely unbuckle myself, open the door, step outside, take a smoke break, and view the entire scene of the battle frozen in the middle of nowhere. I could have walked between the tracers and gotten a light from one of the bullets. The whole flight froze in the middle of the sky. I could see myself from the outside, shrunken by the sound of the whizzing tracers. It was even funny. A jet whistle near the cockpit resumed the passage of time. The smoking shells went straight into the source of the tracers, and everything stopped. The attack helicopter quieted the asshole by hitting it right at the machine gun position. I was saved. On the ground, there was an even more furious firefight going on, but it didn't matter anymore. All the same, I was saved. When we got back to the Gulf area, we were told that the next morning awaited the first landing in the Bong Sun Valley. The first landing was scheduled for the dog zone. We were to clear a beachhead for the grunts. The Navy and artillery had time to pound the dog with shells. The Marines were starting the landing on a beach 10 miles from the zone, and the cavalry was sending out 100 slicks to take over the area. A formation of 100 helicopters turns into a train of disparate pieces that pile up and stretch out in an accordion like the flow of traffic in a rewind. At first you're trying to make up the distance to the squad ahead, and a second later you're almost going into a hover, trying to slow down. The villages we came across during the flight seemed like islands in a sea of rice paddies. This valley was considered one of the most valuable in Vietnam because of its rich rice crop. The people living there supported Uncle Ho, as did 80% of all Vietnamese. The other 20% were in cities taken over by the Americans and participated in maintaining the colonial system that had been imposed by the French and was now run by the Americans. I knew this from Wendell's stories. He used to say, "Read Street Without Joy, and you'll understand it all for yourself," but you couldn't get that book in Vietnam. And even if you could, I still wouldn't believe what I was reading. I wouldn't have believed it because Kennedy, McNamara, Johnson, and the others obviously knew about No Joy Street and sent us here anyway. I had no doubt that Bernard Fall was just another crank, patron of the nutty Vietnamese who have become a cancerous tumor on the body of our country. And the most important proof of all my ideas was the fact that Wendell was personally stuck next to me doing the same things. And Wendell was no fool. Yellow one, you're off course. No response. Yellow one, turn left 20 degrees. Yellow one, the lead helicopter of our giant horde, didn't respond. Instead, it slowed down even more and veered off course. Mate and I were travelling quite a distance, the fourth car in the squadron or so. We dropped our speed to 20 knots. The whole formation huddled together 100 feet above the scattered villages below. Yellow one, do you read me? No answer. Yellow 2, lead the line. Take a 40-degree left. Roger that. We've got our leader again. Yellow 1's radio communications were out of order, and he had been waving his arms for a long time, trying to show Yellow 2 to overtake, but Yellow 2 was following the lead helicopter relentlessly. Villagers spilled outside directly below us, firing at the helicopters which were flying low and slow. In one village I noticed a crowd of about 50 people just standing there, covering their eyes from the sun with their palms and watching us. Some of them were firing because the machines were reporting hits. I saw only women, children and men watching the air parade, but no weapons. As our formation flew over another village on the route, More and more cars started reporting hits. Connors was shot in the fuel tank and had to fall behind. Another helicopter reported a dead pilot, and the machine was turned back. It was some farmer, but he managed to stay out of sight. In the meantime, we continued to sail by at low altitude and speed. A helicopter coming directly in front of us reported a hit. At the same moment I saw the gunner. In the midst of all the people, buffaloes, thatched shacks and palm trees, stood a small bunch of seemingly innocent peasants. In the very centre of this bunch I noticed smoke, and then the gunman. He had a machine gun. I was asked a question at an army entrance exam that was asked of all potential soldiers. Imagine you are driving a truck with soldiers in the back, and you are driving very fast down a muddy road with steep cliffs on the sides, when suddenly a small child runs out in front of you. Do you try to go around the child and swerve to your death, or do you drive straight ahead and hit the child, of course? Everyone knew the right answer: you should hit the child. The situation didn't really matter because it was made up, and neither did the child. So I then answered that I would stop the truck. No, you can't stop the truck. It's going too fast. Well, then I'm not going that fast on a bad road. You misunderstand a little bit. There's no choice here but to kill the child or kill your comrades. If I really have no choice, I'll go ahead and run over the child. That's exactly what we wanted to hear. Now the question was, how do you kill a gunner who just killed several pilots without punching through the human shield of innocence around him? I see the gunner, sir, reported Rubensky, the onboard gunner. Hit the ground. Scare the men away, I ordered. Aye, sir. Rubensky, one of the most accurate gunners, opened fire as we neared the gunner's position. All the onlookers remained near the village, directly on our right side, 100 feet away. The bullets raised muddy fountains of water in the flooded rice paddy, glinting right in front of a bunch of people. The Viet Cong gunner was concentrating on the other helicopter and hadn't noticed Rubensky's fire yet. I hoped with all my soul that the black pajamas, pointy hats, and small children would scatter and reveal the gunman. Were they tied to the ground? When the bullets rang out 50 feet in front of them, I knew they wouldn't budge. The hits made them flail their arms and roll on the ground. After a time that seemed like an eternity, the gunner appeared in front of us, still firing. Rubensky didn't stop firing either. The barrel of a Viet Cong machine gunner jabbed down on the turret, and the gunner slid to the ground. A dozen bodies lay around like knocked-down skittles. A truck flattened a child. 20 helicopters took damage, 5 were shot down, 2 pilots and 2 gunners died as we floundered over the villages on the way to the Dog. The area itself turned out to be an ancient Vietnamese cemetery, and we captured the area without much trouble. Helicopters landed in squads, dropped off the pawns, and came back for more. By the evening of that day, the Dog Zone had become an American outpost in the middle of the Viet Cong wilderness. Nate and I and 3 other crews were left overnight in the zone with the grunts as backup helicopters for the infantry commander. It drizzled all night. Why didn't they duck? I sat in my chair, staring into the darkness. The Viet Cong ordered them to stand. How do you make people stand in front of bullets? He would shoot them if they started running. But if they started running, he wouldn't have time to shoot them, because we'd kill him first. Obviously, they were more afraid of him than they were of us. Is that what this is about? They were so afraid of getting killed that they kept standing there to get killed. Easterners think differently. The machine guns rattled all night, but I couldn't sleep for another reason. I had a picture before my eyes of what had happened. I remembered all the faces clearly. An old woman chewing betel nut nodded weakly as the bullets struck her. A child turned to run away, but was mangled by bullets right as he moved. The woman squealed and rushed to the child, but she too was hit. The gunman did not stop firing. I saw the scene over and over again until I had memorized each person's face. They remembered me too. They nodded and smiled, turned around, spun around, and died. At 3 a.m, the noise of gunfire came right up to the edge of the cemetery. A grunt ran up to us and ordered us to start up. 15 minutes later, the firing stopped, and the same grumpy man told us we could kill the cars. The next morning, Nate and I headed 50 miles south to a place called Polygon, where the remnants of our battalion, along with part of the 227th Battalion, had managed to set up camp. We occupied a general tent with Morris, Decker, Daisy, Sherman, and Farris. Ressler was still on furlough. My bunk was lost, so I made myself a stretcher by putting 2 sticks parallel between the ammunition boxes and pulling a blanket over the top. We set up at the old Republic of Vietnam Army training ground near Phu Cat Village, off Route 1. About 1,000 South Korean soldiers from the Tiger Division stood around the perimeter as guards. This was reassuring because the South Korean soldiers were badass thugs. They would pass the time until dawn pounding each other for fun. After a quick lunch, Nate and I climbed back into the air and joined the 2 squads returning to the dog zone. At the zone, we loaded up with grunts and flew out to the task at hand. Farris flew in the lead. The lead helicopter was to meet us on the way and escort us to the drop zone. "Pastor 6, can you see me?" "Affirmative," Farris replied. "Keep your eyes on me. I'm coming in." The helicopter dived from 1,000 feet down and began to approach one of the cleared areas. I thought it would fly farther over, but it leveled off and came down. Rice bushes swayed around it. "This way, Pastor Squad. All clear." That was the first and last time I'd ever seen a landing technique like that. It looked good from the outside. We've arrived at an extremely calm landing zone. The lead helicopter lowered its nose and headed north over the trees. Farris gave the command. To arms, and we followed in tight formation. "Pick your spots," Farris continued over the comms. The landing zone was narrow, so I was a little behind the second helicopter and sat behind him. As we leveled off, we were enveloped by fine spray from the rice paddies. I decided not to land fully, but to stay in a hover just above the water. The grunts started jumping out without waiting to touch the ground. It was already a habit rather than a battle frenzy. A normal landing in a calm zone. We waited 30 seconds until Farris was sure everyone had landed. We got machine gun fire from 3 positions at once. They pinned us in front, left flank, and rear. I noticed flares behind the tree line 50 yards away. They were blocking the path for takeoff. I began pushing the pedals as hard as I could, turning the car around in a parry and waiting for Farris' signal. I could see only one machine gunner's position. He was sitting there firing at us at his pleasure. Our onboard machine gunners couldn't stick out that far, so they concentrated on flank positions. As I swung left and right, I heard one Utes. Then Farris went for a takeoff, flying around the gunner's forward position on the right, and we sat on his tail. As we flew over the trees, another Viet Cong machine gunner appeared from somewhere and started pouring tracers into our formation. I climbed a little higher than the others and began to make small, sharp turns to the right and left. As we gained altitude, all the machine guns from below concentrated on our 8 machines. I continued to hover in the air, firmly believing in Lisa's right, do your best to become an unattractive target. Soon we were out of range. 6 of the 8 helicopters were damaged, and 2 of the onboard gunners were killed. Our helicopter took 1 bullet while still on the ground. Subsequently, I checked the angle at which the bullet entered the machine, and found that the hit had occurred during my turn in low parry. The bullet flew right beside me at chest level and lodged in the tail beam. I was sure my evasive tactics had saved my life. "If you hadn't moved at all, the bullet might as well have missed you," Nate argued when we got back to the range. "The bullet hit me as I was turning to the right. I mean, if I hadn't turned, it would have hit the cab." "You don't know that. Just lucky." Lucky? No, just luck. What if you'd turned around to get shot? The same technique could have gotten you killed." Of course he was right, but I firmly believe I dodged that bullet myself. "What about the takeoff?" Everyone else was torn to shreds, I continued. "Look, Mason, when it's your time to die, there's nothing you can do. There's no way to calculate the odds. So you weren't meant to get shot today. So you're saying I should just sit back and take it easy on the others? I can't do that. I know exactly what it's like to aim at a Huey from the ground. If one car in the formation is twitching like a lunatic, I won't even take aim at it. I'll switch to the others. Nate nodded and took a sip of coffee. Look, if it makes you feel better, then keep it up. But as far as I'm concerned, you're just suffering from nonsense. We learned that one of the machine gunners was hit right in the body armor he was lucky enough to be wearing that time, and he easily stopped the bullet. I immediately thought of the bullet that could have hit me in the chest, and once again freaked out at the lack of equipment in the company. Despite all the shelling we had been under in the last 5 months, we continued to be ignored. We must have lost too few pilots. The Viet Cong held the valley under fire. This was their home, and they were entrenched in positions. We were shot at everywhere we flew. In 2 days, 45 of our slicks were badly damaged. The 228th Battalion lost several Chinooks, which was rare in Nha Trang, and 10 pilots. We thought the C-130 Hercules that had crashed and burned at An Key Pass the day before, taking the lives of 80 soldiers, had also been hit from the ground. That night, Nate, Maurice, Decker, and I drove to a village a little farther down the road. I took some pictures of smiling kids, and we bought candles and soap from a small shop. On the way back, sitting in the back of the truck, we complained about the lack of body armor. Morris sat with his arms crossed over his chest as the truck shook over the bumps. I talked to a friend of mine from battalion, he said. He says we should be getting a bunch of protection any day now. The truck stopped outside the mess hall, and as we climbed out of the back, Decker said, "Yeah, any day now. I imagine he'd be in a hurry if he was flying in our shit." The next day, January 31st, we went for another landing. The zone was called Quebec. It was 5 miles behind the dog zone. The dog zone had become a big camp where a bunch of our infantrymen had been moved. There was no safer place in the valley than the dog zone. When 12 helicopters were coming in for a landing and crossing the river on a new mission, one of the machines on the right flank took a bullet from a peaceful village. We were stuck on the ground for about an hour, watching the Air Force Phantoms pelt the Quebec with endless shells. I sat on the roof of my Huey and admired the spectacle. At the very end of their turns, the Phantoms would dive down and turn on the afterburner to cut down on the thrust of the engines. It was quite a show. I was ready to sit and watch it all day long. At the same time, I occasionally glanced over at the 2 grunts who were trying to set up a claymore mine just ahead of us, 100 feet away. When I was in advanced infantryman training, we had a course on subversion, so I was interested in what was going on. The claymore mine is shaped like a crescent moon. It's placed with the convex side facing the enemy. It detonates at a distance and blasts millions of small pieces of wire around it, tearing victims to shreds. While the grunts were fixing the mine on the ground, it went off. The 2 soldiers on either side of them were thrown aside in mangled, lifeless pieces. The carnival continues, I thought. The Phantoms have finished fire training the Quebecers, and the air show has stopped. "Let's take off." "Let's go," yelled Williams. 8 grunts jumped into each helicopter. We launched, plugged into the communications channel, and took to the air. Nate and I followed the second car, behind Morris and Decker. The smoke from the pre-bombing hung lazily over the Quebec area as we flew past to approach the landing from the south. Pastor 6, Station 6. Head south. Viet Cong machine gunners ahead. Station 6 is flying over us. Pastor 6, roger that. Roger that. I'm on it. Williams has begun to turn back toward the drop zone. Pastor 6, artillery is still shelling the area. Be careful. Roger that. Pastor 6 ready for landing. The landing zone was a narrow strip of dry sand with brush on the sides, which was located near the bottom of the hills at the west end of the valley. Following previous instructions, we lined up in a staggered formation. Pastor 6, small caliber fire from the west. Connors reported. Yellow squad. This is Pastor 6. Pick your spots. It's dangerous in the zone. Williams hovered just above the ground, leveling off for landing. Morris and Decker were coming within 50 feet of him, and I was coming within 100 feet of them. Pastor 6, this is Yellow 2. Captain Morris is hit. Captain Morris is badly wounded. Morris's car suddenly dived down and hit the ground. Yellow 4, we're taking fire from the right. Nothing could be seen on the right except a long line of dense bushes. Captain Morris is down. Captain Morris is down. Roger, Yellow 2. Cars destroyed. I'm getting out. I saw Decker jump out of his Huey as we landed right behind him. He landed on the ground next to the car with a sawed-off shotgun at the ready. He had his back to the Viet Cong. Nate reported. Pastor 6, this is Yellow 3. We'll pick up Decker and his crew. Negative, Yellow 3. Clear the landing zone for the next squad. All the grunts disembarked. Some of them rushed toward Decker, ducking under bullets, and led him away. The infantrymen tried to keep their heads down. Sand was flying from the Viet Cong's bullets. Yellow squad. Let's go. Williams was off the ground. As I sprinted for takeoff past Decker's still working helicopter, I glanced inside the cockpit and saw Morris sitting in the right seat with his head resting on his chest. He seemed to be dozing off. Whoa. We've been hit. Thump, 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 thump. The machine gunner who killed Morris was coming after us. I put on full power and started climbing up. I got well above Williams, and at about 1,000 feet we had engine failure. Silence. I dropped a step. This was my first real emergency landing, and I was very lucky. Even though I had no choice, I landed exactly where I wanted to. The place was safe. I slid 10 feet after landing. The propellers slowed and stopped. The flight mechanic started examining the damage before I even got outside. 4 holes in the fuel line, sir. This car's not going anywhere today. Nate and I stayed by the chopper while our squad flew back to Quebec. I don't know about Nate, but I was shaking from the cold under the blazing sun. The battalion always sent out at least one repair helicopter in situations like this. Mechanics would land in safe zones and see if they could fix the car on the spot. I could hear the loud noise of a Huey crossing the dog zone 2 miles away. I doubt a formation of Hueys could have taken anyone by surprise. When the car was a quarter of a mile away, the deafening slam of the carrier propellers was replaced by the whirring of the tail rotor and the whistling howl of the turbine. The machine landed 100 feet behind us, raising a small sandstorm before dropping pitch. The turbine went silent, the blades slowing down. 2 expert mechanics rushed to our helicopter. The flight mechanic showed the damage under the engine hood, and they got busy examining the insides of the Huey. Leaving them alone with the engine, I headed over to the repair Huey to say hello to the pilot. It was Riker. Was anyone hurt? He asked. He didn't know about Morris. I stood by the skids and tried to find the words to break the news to Riker, who was disentangling himself from his harness. When I opened my mouth, my face contorted into a pained grin. Morris had been shot and killed. Riker's face showed shock, which was instantly replaced by the same smirk. What, Morris? Yeah, a few minutes ago. At the Quebec. I spoke curtly, trying to change my expression. How could I even smirk? Riker had the same problem, his mouth curved into a smile, but his face was frozen in pain. He tried to change the topic of conversation to relieve the obsession. What's wrong with your car? Nothing much. The fuel line was punctured. So everything's okay? He asked absent-mindedly. Aha. It's fine. Where did he get hit? Riker asked. The task of keeping his composure was beyond him, and he involuntarily stretched his mouth into the same horrible grin. I don't know, but I think it was in the chest. Even like that? I think so. We were both embarrassed, so we stopped talking and sat down on the sandy grass, smoking a cigarette. The mechanics were still tinkering with the helicopter. Nate, who had been watching them curiously, came over. Bob told you about Morris? Nate tried to look brave and businesslike. Aha. What about Decker, by the way? Riker asked. He's still in the drop zone. Oh yeah? Why didn't they take him? There was heavy gunfire. Decker jumped out and took cover with the grunts on the ground, and Williams wouldn't let us wait for him. Why not? Why not? There was no other way. The next squad was breathing down our necks, and we could lose someone else trying to get Decker to the car. I still don't see how he could have been left there. He'll be fine, Nate assured me. He's got a good old-fashioned sawed-off shotgun with him. Sir, the car's in no condition to fly. The mechanic turned to Riker. Roger that. We're back on our feet. You guys want a ride to the polygon for a new helicopter? You're still asking, I said. I want to get back into the fight as soon as possible. Nate and Riker smiled at my bravado. Then Riker spoke up. You guys remember that Croton model he made? I wonder where it is now. An hour later, Nate and I were back in the air. We joined our squadron and proceeded to deliver the grunts to Quebec. Decker flew out of the area with the next squad. Later that afternoon, after we had replaced 2 dead lieutenants, delivered reinforcements, and taken out the wounded, the grunts finally captured Quebec, both Sandacres in their entirety. 2 machine guns and 10 rifles were found in a long trench behind those seemingly innocuous bushes. By dusk we were back at the polygon. Decker was sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at the dirt with his elbows on his knees and his face in the palms of his hands. I was glad he was back. Hey, Dick. Dick. Someone stopped me with a shake of their head. I nodded. Without reaching him, I stepped outside, walked back into the tent from the other end, and sat down on my stretcher. Nate, who was sitting across from me, was pouring old Grandpa into the cap of a flask. You want one? Yeah, I could use some. I filled the cap a couple inches, refilled the water, and stirred with my finger. We sat in silence. Nate was rereading one of his letters, and I was watching Decker. Everyone else in the tent was talking quietly, keeping their distance from the grieving pilot. He was pale. Finally looked up with some childlike confusion, shook his head, and smiled weakly. He auto-rotated. We stared at him, waiting for him to continue. But he fell silent. Sherman broke the silence. Morris? Yeah, when he died, he dropped the throttle before he auto-rotated. But we were too close to the ground, so the car dove down and bogged down in the sand. Decker wrinkled his nose in pain and fell silent. I pondered. Dive down, there was nothing wrong with the car. They landed a little harder than usual, but the helicopter was steady and running when Decker jumped out. Decker grimly continued. The bullet flew in through the triangular window, went through his body armor like it wasn't even there, and hit him in the heart. The vest only stopped it from the back. He dropped the throttle like he wanted to go into auto-rotation, and we crashed before I could do anything. He stopped for a second. If I'd reacted faster, we wouldn't have crashed. You did everything right, Sherman objected. That's what you think. Now imagine your best friend gets shot right in front of you, and you can't even keep the fucking helicopter in the air. He managed to do the right thing, even when he was dying. He auto-rotated, but I just didn't have time to react. Look, Decker, Morris was dead by then. What does that have to do with the landing? Sherman asked. Decker suddenly got to his feet. He's dead. And it's my fault. He grabbed his rifle and walked out of the tent. God, Nate said. I don't understand why he blames himself, Sherman asked. Morris was already dead. Besides, the helicopter hadn't crashed. We all looked at Sherman. Of course he was right, but his rationality was straining. It was completely out of place. The commander didn't say anything about Morris, except that we'd been asked to raise money for flowers for his wife, but Sherman volunteered to give a little speech that night. Well, we'd had a lot of luck up to this point. But it was only a matter of time. Many more pilots had died in other companies, and now it was our turn. So we've got a 1 in 5 statistic. 1 out of every 5 pilots is destined to die. We've only lost 2 guys, and that's 5 below average. We were just lucky. I hated Sherman. According to him, we weren't honouring our commitments before we died. We're behind on our deaths, aren't we? All right, we'll get to the bottom of this. All right, guys, let's all die fast. The beach was covered in slippery red clay. Connors claimed it was better than the Caribbean. The sand in the Caribbean makes it hard to slip into the water. You can't argue with that. You had to hold on to bushes to keep from sliding into the warm red water. And when you got to the centre of the pond, there were so many layers of sticky clay under your feet that it felt like you were touching the bottom, when in fact you weren't. I waded into the pond up to my chin and looked back at the others. Banjo was ducking under, diving in headfirst, quite a daring act in such slimy water, and emerging a few feet from the previous spot. Buddy, why are you diving headfirst into that shit? Kaiser asked. Kaiser, like me, wasn't diving anywhere, just standing in the water up to his chin, enjoying the relative coolness. Banjo only laughed and dove in again. An old Vietnamese woman laughed as she looked at him, having broken away from weeding a field near the pond. 4 or 5 women and 2 men watched as we bathed naked in the pond that served as a watering hole for the buffalo. The women smiled embarrassedly. The naked strangers were making complete assholes of themselves. We regarded their smiles as friendly approval. A patrol of South Korean soldiers standing guard on the bridge 100 feet away from us laughed too. I found out later that Koreans were forbidden to walk around undressed in full view of the Vietnamese because it was considered a demonstration of their vulnerability to the enemy. Nate was sitting on his clothes in the sunshine when suddenly a girl selling coke loomed in front of him. Noticing her, he crossed his legs in confusion. Coke girls were ubiquitous. They would come to our parking lots and bring plastic braided Coke bottles. 50 cents, soldier. Buy a Coca-Cola? They were exceptionally young and cute, so I never bought a Coke. I was convinced the drink was poisoned. Hey, Nate, you can see the pod, Connors yelled. Nate glared at him, trying to refuse the Coke at the same time, and squeezed his legs tighter. I'm love baiting here, smartass. That's how you do it. Except the bait's a little short. Everybody's laughing. No one's going to give you anything, Connors. You've got a cock the size of a gramophone needle. Have you made up your mind? I asked. Yeah, and I suggest you think about it, Kaiser said. Air America. Who are those guys? They're considered a civilian airline, but they're backed by the CIA. How much are they paying? That's the whole point. They guarantee 20 grand, but their average salary is 35. Plus, they give you discounts at garrison stores, discount airfare and 10 days vacation every month. 20 grand? I was making 7. Aha. You can join them right now before you get out of the army. You're gonna do that? Yeah, I've only got 2 months left in the service, so I'll quietly finish up and move to Saigon as a civilian. Kaiser slapped the envelope on his hand. The letter came today. Everything has already been arranged. What do you say, Mason? You want me to scribble you an address? I'd rather fly corn planes in Florida than snitch to the CIA in Vietnam. You became a CIA agent? Nate asked Kaiser. Not agents. Pilot. Air America, you hear that? You like our job, don't you? Holy shit, they don't fly landing missions. They fly couriers and liaisons to Cambodia, or picking up downed pilots when the army can't help. We risk a lot more than they do, and we get a pittance. What makes you think they'd take a moron like you? There's fewer assholes than you think, Nate. You'll see. In 2 months, I'll be making 20 grand a pop in a safe, dust-free job. Nate placed the record on top of the box. There was a fold-out record player sticking out of the corner of the box. Is that a turntable? I asked. Huh. Nice, huh? My wife sent it for Christmas, but it just arrived. The music started playing. You gotta be kidding me. Kaiser shrieked. A magical dragon named Puff. I'm going to puke. He got up and walked away. Why are you so sad, Kaiser? Nate hummed along with the song under his breath. Barber, Wendell's comrade, ducked through the tent doors. Mason, have you seen Wendell? No. I have. He's over by the mess tent, making a foxhole, Nate reported. Thank you. Barber's gone. Why is he making a foxhole? I asked him. He keeps saying we're going to get shot at. I think he's taking Hanoi Hannah's words seriously, Nate explained. A magic dragon named Puff was disturbing. A deadly P-47 strike aircraft equipped with a Gatling machine gun was named after that wussy song. I couldn't listen. I'm going to go talk to Wendell. In the twilight, I made out a small pile of dirt next to the tent. When I got closer, I saw an army cap sticking out of the ground. The cap moved, and Wendell's smile shone under the visor. Hey, Mason. Hey, Wendell. Nice foxhole. You think I'm crazy too? No, not at all. Wendell stretched his chin over the edge of the 5-foot-deep hole while fingering the bottom with his hands. A large tin can full of sand squeezed between his chest and the narrow walls. He tipped it over in a heap near the pit. The Viet Cong love mortars, and we're defenseless, he explained. We're not allowed to make trenches. We have to hide in that ditch over there. It's too wide. If a shell hits it, we'll be hamburger patties. So I've decided to make my own trench. I'm below ground level, so I'm very hard to hit. That's clever. No kidding. It's only tricky compared to what the knuckleheads tell us to do. He was alluding to the cavalry's anti-trenching policy, which was an attempt to protect the landscape of the camp. Sometimes I think the gardener is in charge of this war, he added. I walked to the technical area and took a long exposure shot of Reacher and a few other mechanics fiddling with the Huey under the bright spotlights. Thousands of moths swirled around the lights as Reacher and Rubensky, armed with wrenches and screwdrivers, tried to get the helicopter back on its feet by the next morning. They did this every night. Our helicopters were parked in a long row, one behind the other, along with 8 other Hueys on the range. The remaining vehicles were hidden in the moonless darkness. When I returned, the music was no longer playing and Nate was asleep. I stripped down to my underwear and covered myself with the lining of my raincoat. I couldn't sleep. Why don't I listen to Kaiser? Go to work for Air America and get this whole thing over with. 20 grand a year, after all. Patience has been complaining about money problems in her letters for years. We were paying for a new Volvo, spending a lot of money on an expensive bedroom set, making life insurance premiums, and paying huge rent for a place in Cape Coral. 20 grand would have transported us to a new world, which, unfortunately, was in this stinking country. Anything but that. A mosquito burrowed into my arm, but I didn't even twitch. An acquaintance of mine from a neighboring company was still chilling in a hotel in Japan while he was being treated for malaria. I fidgeted with overexcitement. It was getting harder to fall asleep every night. I thought about jerking off, but it wasn't worth the gamble. I had to be very careful because the slightest crack or creak in the bed could provoke some smartass to yell, "Hey, someone's fist fucking me." Then I'd have to cough artificially. So far I'd never been caught, but I knew it was only a matter of time. Eventually my thoughts returned to the question I had been pondering since my arrival. I was designing a bamboo clock. I had already decided on the number of elements of the mechanism, how the bamboo should be cut for the gears, and how to set the escapement. I pondered the plan, looking for mistakes. And gradually I fell into a dream. Boom. Bang, 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 bang. I sat up half asleep, not understanding anything. Heavy shells flying from the ditch side of the range shook the ground. Mortars. Someone yelled. Mortars? Fuck. I grabbed my pistol belt and shoved my feet into my boots. People ran past. Shells exploded over the sandy embankment in front of the ditch. Soldiers scrambled to the bottom of the trench. I didn't go down there. Wendell was right, if a shell hit there, it would be a meat grinder. I decided to look for other cover. I held the gun in front of me as I ran. My unlaced boots were about to fall off my feet, my cock was about to fall out of my underpants. Our mortar batteries started shooting back. I could hear the pilots in charge of evacuating the helicopters being ordered in a frantic voice to start up. This was of no concern to me, so I continued to seek cover. Finally, I crawled under a truck and watched the explosions. They were terribly powerful and unpredictable. So far, not a single shell had hit the compound. I lay under the truck for several minutes, until it occurred to me that if a shell hit, the truck would explode and blow me to pieces. I rolled outside and huddled in a small notch in the sand. The flares cast shadows. 50th caliber tracers flew slowly overhead, heading in our direction. They were definitely Viet Cong. The Hueys had long since started up, but never took off. As the flares headed toward the South Korean patrol's positions, I noticed Wendell's helmet thrashing around in the middle of his sand pile. And why is he always right? I heard the sounds of machine gun fire tearing up the dark sky above us. Our attack helicopters were out on the attack line and sending several streams of tracers toward the foothills behind the South Korean soldiers' positions. So far, not a single shell had managed to fly over the sandy embankment in front of the trench. Our helicopters stood wound up without taking off. After 15 minutes, everything went quiet. All that remained was the sound of our return fire. I rose to my feet and tried to shake the sand off my sweaty skin. My hands were shaking and I cursed the Viet Cong, mortars, and the army. The pilots in charge of the evacuation were returning from the parking lot. "You hear me, asshole? I was sent to 227. "What the fuck were you doing in my chair?" I heard someone's voice. The commander said I was flying it, you idiot. The helicopters couldn't get off the ground because there were too many people on board. The weight of the pilots and flight mechanics crammed inside the machines kept them on the ground, while people argued over who should fly. The Koreans sent out their Tiger squads. They came back with mortar barrels, base plates, and severed Viet Cong heads. More Korean soldiers complained that our attack helicopters had shot up several of their squads. We looked like a bunch of brats compared to the South Korean mercenaries. The rest of the night I kept waking up, ready to run for cover. But all was calm. Pastor 6, there is a machine gun position on your takeoff path. The attack helicopters dived back and forth in front of us, never ceasing fire. Williams was walking in front of us. He was right in front of the tree line, so he had to squeeze everything he could out of his Huey to fly over them. The attack helicopters circled ahead of us, scorching the jungle. Pastor 6, take a left. You're flying straight at the gunner. No response. Left. Left. The attack helicopter pilot went out of his mind as he watched us take off right over the position he was taking us away from. It was a separate machine gunner. As we flew over, he fired a line into our belly. "Sir, one of the grunts is down," reported Miller, the flight mechanic. Grumpy, the black guy, took a bullet in the arse. I heard our machine gunner, Simmons, yelling something unintelligible in the general commotion. "Sir?" "That's Simmons' brother," Miller reported. Pastor 6, I came on the line. "We've got a casualty on board. We're heading to the infirmary." "Copy that." We landed next to a mobile army surgical hospital that had been brought in on the Sikorsky from the Gulf area. The medics ran up to us and loaded the soldier onto a stretcher. Simmons ran around the other side of the helicopter and hurried next to the stretcher, all in tears. We waited. A few minutes later he came outside, his cheeks glistening, but he was smiling. "The doctors say he's going to be fine. They'll send him home," he informed the flight mechanic. The legendary $1 million injury. Then I remembered how Simmons had identified his other brother at the bottom of the pile of bodies at Pleiku. Neither brothers nor fathers and sons should be involved in the same combat actions at the same time. I knew 2 men in Vietnam who did not have to be there. I talked to Simmons when we got back to the range. Yes, sir, I know, he replied. So talk to the commander. He'll get you out of here. You've already lost one brother, the other one just got hit. Your family has had enough. He smiled and said, No, I'll stay. Why? Somebody has to stay. He sounded serious. It felt like I was in a movie. Maybe he was thinking the same thing. The fighting moved from the valley near Bongsun village north to the narrow and Lao Valley, which was surrounded by high mountains. We landed in rice paddies. The grunts who had poured out of the Huey, to their surprise, bobbed down in the water, trying to reach the shelter behind the path. These fields were treacherous. When we landed on them for parking, the cars would slip into the mire up to their bellies and get stuck. Liz had taught me the proper way to take off in such situations months ago in Happy Valley. You can't just jump out of the swamp, he explained. First get the nose up to release the skids a little bit, then level the car out and slowly apply throttle, very slowly, until the skids are completely free. Otherwise, one skid will pop out and the other will stay in the swamp. Then you'll flip over and crash. Wrestler, who had just returned from his furlough, flew with me. We landed at the field at Nlao to wait for the grunts who were headed for the evacuation zone. Once landed, all the Hueys became like islands in a lake of rice paddies. We were exhausted from the heat. The air from the humidity was as thick as the slush underfoot. The helicopter pilots were squeamish about getting their feet wet, just like cats. There's a reason they became pilots. Grunts get dirty, but not pilots, those were the rules. So Wrestler and I moved behind the seats, sat down in the shade on the floor of the cargo bay, and began rummaging through the boxes of dry rations in search of a snack. When our combat rhythm was disrupted by such lulls, we sometimes saved ourselves by amusing ourselves with a game called Find the Fool. In other words, we tried to make each other laugh. Listen, how do we boil water for coffee? Wrestler asked. Okay, give me that can. I'll make a burner. Oh yeah? Who's going to get under the drain valve? Yeah, all right, Miller will do it now. No, Miller said. Just finish it. We got to stay alert, right? You don't want us to fall asleep and topple over, do you? Wrestler chided him. You won't fall asleep, and I ain't going into that shit for kerosene. I glanced at Rubensky, who was sitting by the door near his machine gun. Rubensky. Grunts kind of like dirt. Can you get me some fuel? No, and I'm not a grump. I used to be a grump, but now I'm a machine gunner. What's the difference? Because a grump would go get fuel for you, and I won't. Fair enough. I looked around and noticed a can burner blazing on the trail near the Huey that was parked to the side of us. Hey guys, I yelled. Share some coffee, huh? Bend over, Nate shouted. Hey, be human. I'm nothing without my morning coffee. You already are, Mason. God damn it. You're sick of your whining. I'll give you fucking fuel. Rubensky jumped out and went knee-deep in a leech-infested swamp. That's my kind of thing. American grunts don't give up, I yelled. Machine gunners, shouted back Rubensky, slowly making his way toward Nate's car. When he was almost to the guys, there was a shout from the front. Start. Damn you. Rubensky turned and waded back through the swamp. Bitch. We started up and reported over the comms. The grunts were approaching through the fields, each step difficult. They were tired, weary, shabby and unshaven. The ammunition boxes dropped to the compartment floor with a tired clanking sound. Rifles, flasks and helmets followed. When 8 men climbed into the compartment, the entire floor disappeared under a layer of dirt and rice shoots,